everybody. Great to see everybody here for our final lecture in this series on the book. We're here in the lecture 11, 12. We're combining them into one. There's a total of 12 lectures because lecture 6 was a two-parter because it was a long one. And today we're just going to basically go over what we went through. We're going to summarize a lot of what we talked about and leave some time for questions. It's kind of more, it's like a review and a conclusion of everything we talked about. And also, I'd love to take your guys' questions. Thank you to everybody who's been here from the beginning or joined throughout. I hope you guys learned a lot in the lecture and that it's been beneficial. But let's start out by going over the main points of kind of how we got here. So, first and foremost, we started out in our very first lecture, chapter 1 of the book, entitled Conveniently Righteous, with the question of can mankind arrive at an objective value system? And we went through some court cases, some different historical factors. We went through the basic ideas that human beings are basically a tainted juror in our analogy, in the sense that we want more than anything else in the world is to pursue pleasure, whether it's security, financial, physical, emotional. And then it doesn't really matter if we have one person is biased, the entire society is essentially biased because the society is just comprised of many individuals. So we really, at the end of the first lecture and the first chapter of the book also, we kind of left things off in the sense where if we're really going to be honest with ourselves, that it's really not something that's possible. That what's really happening is that society is doing what's comfortable for it, and we saw this within different societies, even in modern time, that even within our the Western culture, we can't really agree on what murder even is. If you guys remember the case, the People versus Fumiku Kumara, which is a great example. But there's many other different types of court cases from around the world, and just basic things that we see that are inherent in different cultures, where even people alive today, not necessarily even 1,000 years ago, people alive today have a very, very different idea of what's good or bad. And that comes from their background, their different ideologies, their culture. And bottom line is that mankind, most people's countries and cultures, they function within their respective societal norms, which they attribute to moral systems. And within these systems, we found no absolute right and wrongs. So anybody who didn't hear these initial lectures, they're all up now on the Noahide Academy. And I encourage you guys to go back from the beginning. And we started out in the first lecture asking these questions. And then at the end of the lecture, we said, okay, how can a moral or value system even potentially exist that's absolute, since mankind is constantly moving the bar, right? Based on what's most comfortable for the given society. And we came to a conclusion that if we want to avoid this cultural relativism, right, with this underlying problem being that no human being can truly judge what is right or wrong, because we're all a product of our culture, our predispositions, and our desires, we came to the logical necessity of divine morality. So, as we stated, the problem really is the recognition of the problem that human values are relative and culturally bound. And the only way there could even theoretically be an absolute value system is if a force that is unbound by the physical laws would set these values. And this creator, we call him, would be a type of divine referee, someone who understands human nature, free from physical desires, and could objectively tell us what's right or wrong as it relates to his creation. And then we said, okay, if such a creator were to exist, we would need to be able to objectively verify the existence of this creator, and not just the creator. And this is really where the book goes into a completely different area from from other theological concepts is also the proof that this specific creator gave a divine code or moral value system. As we said, many movements, religious or otherwise, will cite the argument for intelligent design, right? We went through that in chapter 3 extensively, where we talked about the more something is complex, that shows that that it wasn't arbitrary, that it wasn't random, and the more complex the design, the smarter the designer. So many movements cite this argument, say the world is obviously extremely complex. And just as a hurricane didn't sweep through a junkyard to form a 770 jumbo airplane, so we as human beings weren't so lucky to arrive at our current state by chance. So from this point, though, most, if not all, besides Judaism, make a very big logical leap of faith because they say, okay, there's a creator, and now therefore, and for Muslims, that will be accept the Muhammad and the Quran. Muhammad is God's prophet, and here's this book that Allah wants you to live by. Christians will say, okay, here's the Bible, here's the New Testament. You need to accept Jesus because there's a creator, and many other religious movements that we talked about in detail. But in reality, the fact that there is a creator, that doesn't really tell me much about this divine value system. Who says that this creator even wants anything from me? Right? Maybe this creator created the world and went off on vacation and it doesn't really care what people do. Who said that he's good? Who said that he cares? And who says that he's involved in the day-to-day of our lives to the point where he cares if I lie or steal or cheat or eat, a limb from a live animal or pork or anything else? So we said in order to answer this question, we're really going to need evidence not only of a creator, but that this creator provided this divine code or value system to mankind. And then we went through the second lecture. We talked about different approaches to evidence. I'm not going to take too much time to review that right now, if at all. Anyone who wants to know how we approach the evidence and subjective evidence, objective evidence, how evidence should be viewed, different. The very important lecture is the second lecture, which really talks about what tools are we going to use to verify the existence of a creator and his divine code. And then we went on to the chapters that started dealing with the evidence itself. Our third lecture is a lecture called Introduction to Divine Indications. And it talked a lot about different approaches to Torah and science and the idea of, we talked at length also in that lecture about intelligent design. The biggest highlight, I would say there's a few highlights from that lecture, but the few main ones would be, we talked in depth about Professor George Wald and how belief in spontaneous generation is a fanatic religion within itself. That George Wald was one of the researchers in the DNA, and he himself came to the conclusion that it's mathematically impossible that organisms, that these complex molecules could form on their own in order to form organisms. But then he said, we're here, so it's a philosophical necessity. And then we really see here that it really just depends on your preconceived belief, and it's really a belief because you can't, not only can you not verify spontaneous generation, the math is impossible. But that didn't stop him and many others from believing it anyways. So anybody who really is interested in those topics, I'd refer you back to the third lecture. And then the other thing that I want to touch on today that we touched on in that third lecture was the question of if somebody is going to make up the Torah, why would they make up some of these laws? If you guys remember this, and I said back then that a lot of the things I presented in that lecture were not yet really evidence. They were an introduction to the divine indications in the sense that the fact that there's a very odd law, that doesn't necessarily prove anything, right? That's not necessarily evidence. The person who invented this law if there was such a person, could just be, somebody who's insane, right? So it's not really evidence, but I said we would circle back to this after we viewed the hard evidence and re-ask that question. So once we went through lectures 4, 5, and 6, which we'll talk about in a bit, and we saw all the building blocks and the divine indications of evidence through Torah and science, through prophecies, through the transmission system, we now come back to these questions of, for example, the sabbatical year, right? The alternative to the Torah being divine is that somebody or a group of people made it up. And if that's the case, if somebody made it up, why would they make up such a law that would essentially destroy their own economy and would make it much more difficult for them to implement their religion, right? Why would this inventor make up rules about what garments I can wear, right? The wool and linen garments, or why does he care what kind of fish I eat, what kind of animals I eat? So, like we said, that's not evidence in itself. But now when we add that to our cumulative test of rational probability, and we've been through all this evidence, now we can really circle back and say, what's more likely? That this group of people just made up these laws that are really counterproductive to their own purpose of, disseminating this religion, or that these people were just insane and they made up all these crazy things. It becomes much, much more reasonable to take the view that based on all this evidence, this is just another building block that we can add to it, that no human being would even fathom writing a book with these types of laws, because there's no benefit that you can think of from many, many of these things. So again, anybody who's interested in that all that we talked about in the third lecture. Now, lectures 4, 5, and 6, of course, I don't have the ability to get through the details of them. We'll just say what their topics were. And that way, anyone who wants to review those can find those back and go through them. Lecture 4 really dealt with divine indications that have to do with things that the Torah or our sages in the Talmud knew about creation, about the animals, about the fish, about the lunar cycle, about the stars, all sorts of facts that it'd be extremely difficult or unlikely or even impossible for a human being in that time period to have known. For example, the fish, right? We talked about how the Talmud gives us a classification that every fish in the sea that has scales automatically has fins, when they never examined all the different animals and different fish in the sea. Same thing with the kosher signs. Same thing with the lunar cycle, and many other facts that we went through. And really, what I want to focus on is the idea that every one of these pieces of information that were given to the Jewish people in the Torah, in that lecture that we presented, have to do with performance of the commandments. So we know what kind of fish we can eat. So we know how to create the calendar. So we know what animals we can eat, etc. So this was all information that was passed from Moses, from God at Sinai to Moses to the Jewish people throughout the generations. And we can deduce from this information that was given to us, not per se to make a book of proof, right? It was information provided to us so we could perform the commandments, but from examining this evidence and getting a bit deeper into it, we can really see that this is something that a human being could not have written in this time frame. And that's exactly actually what the Talmud says regarding the kosher animal signs. If you guys recall, we talked about how the animals with the chew their cud and split hoof, and the four animals in creation that have one sign and not the other. And the Talmud in Tractate Chulin comes and says that, ask the question, what was Moses a zoologist, right? Like, how does he know this? And they say, from here, this is what we got from Sinai. Shalit bo'olamo, Hashem, God is in charge of his creation, and he knows what he created. So this is actually a place where the Talmud itself used this type of evidence, because I did not make up, as I've stated all the time. My book this is not something that I've made up. These are not things that I've decided are evidence. What I have done is present the different evidence that is throughout the Torah and the Talmud in a concise fashion, in a legal format, somewhat to make it more accessible and easier for people to read. But this is not things that I'm writing or making up or arguments that I'm creating myself. This is me presenting what our sages and what the Torah has told us and the Jewish people have known for thousands of years. So that was lecture four. Before I keep going into lecture five, which for me is the strongest evidence, a summary. Does anybody have any questions up until this point? We good? All right. So, lecture five dealt with prophecies and we defined in detail. This is a very, very important lecture. If there's one lecture you go back and watch out of any of them, I would watch the fifth lecture and study it because this is a type of proof that is just you cannot argue with. There is no, there's different types of evidence you can argue with. You can minimize, you can find all sorts of excuses. They might not be that reasonable, but you can argue with. What is presented in chapter 5, there is no question that the Jewish people were exiled 2,000 years ago and that they were spread all over the world and anti-Semitism and that the Jews survived history. These are like historical facts that any high schooler should know. There's no historian or anybody that's studied even a tiny bit of history that's going to argue these facts. And when we look at what the Torah has outlined for the Jewish people, very precisely, especially in in chapter 28 of Deuteronomy, we see that this is really a plan for history that's been outlined thousands of years in advance, resulting with, and after this whole exile, the Jews will be gathered back to Israel, which obviously has unfolded over the last, since 1948 before our eyes. And this is really an exciting time in history. There's a lot of things going on, and this is, I mean, anybody who's studied the books of the prophets can see that we're headed into that we're in a time frame called the end of days, Acharit Hayamim. And my book doesn't deal with that because those are things that haven't happened yet, so you can't use them as evidence. But we talked about how that is where the side of faith comes in. That Judaism really doesn't talk about having blind faith. Maimonides writes, Yesod Yesodot ve'amud chokhmot, that the pillar of all wisdom ze leida sheyesh Shem Matzui Rishon, is to know that there is a creator, that he is the first, that he's the only. And he doesn't use the word believe, he uses the word know. And the same with the Torah. We were given the Torah and we were given this evidence so we could know that God communicated this information to mankind. Now, the question is, how do we live with that information? What do we choose to do with that information in our day-to-day life? That's really where the faith part comes in. And as it results with these prophecies, for example, because I know that I can go back and look throughout history and see that everything that the Torah outlined that was going to happen in this diaspora for the past 2,000 years happened with laser precision. And again, whoever doesn't remember or who didn't see that lecture, I urge you to go back to really go into depth into that lecture 5 on prophecies. But now that I've seen that this has happened, I believe, I have faith that the next part of it is going to unfold, even though that's something that's unverifiable, right? Because if the Torah has been spot on till now, I don't have any reason to doubt the credibility moving forward. On the same note, if there's a book that is missing the mark over and over again, or an ideology that's wrong over and over again, or has internal contradictions or external contradictions, this becomes much less reliable. How can you believe in what this book will tell you is going to happen when what they've said so far hasn't happened? Just like in court, right? In court, if I can, when I'm questioning a witness, if I can establish that the witness is not credible on a certain issue, right? If you catch this witness lying about something material or just being inaccurate about something that is material, I can ask the judge, or if it's a jury trial, to give the jury an instruction that if you didn't believe the witness on this issue, if you found him not credible on this specific issue, you cannot find him credible on all other issues. Because the moment somebody comes into court and they're willing to lie or not be accurate, or they're not credible, then maybe the last thing they said or the next thing they're going to say is not credible, right? How do you know? The moment something isn't credible, the whole thing falls apart because you just don't know what to believe at that point. So, and it's the same thing when we examine religions, and we talked about that at length in the eighth lecture. But before we jump ahead to that, so that was really what lecture five was about the prophecies, culminating into the time frame of what we call the end of days. Maybe we'll do an end of days only lecture having nothing to do with the book. I've been thinking about doing that, about doing a presentation. Maybe it'll be at least two lectures, maybe three, that goes through all the Jewish end time prophecies. Again, it's a very, very interesting subject to know kind of where we're at within. There's some very, very clear things that are in, especially in the book of Yechezkel, Ezekiel, in the book of Zechariah, in the book of Joel, the book of Daniel. Daniel might need to be a lecture on its own, but some of these things, but again, these are things that are prophetic for things moving forward. So then that was our second part of our building blocks of divine indications, right? We started out with the introduction to the divine indications. We moved on to talk about the different things that the Torah knew and that our sages knew about creation and about the animals. Then we talked about in detail all of the prophecies. And then we moved on to what is technically the strongest evidence out of the three, which is the divine revelation at Sinai and the transmission system. Again, this was a two-part lecture. The first part dealt with the revelation itself and how could it be that a mass revelation could be faked. And we looked into some different ideas, the angel approach. We examined how Islam started, other religions. We examined the later date approach with Christianity. All very, very important lectures. Encourage you guys to review. The bottom line from lecture six is we saw that Hashem said to Moses, God said to Moses, that he agrees with him, right? That a religion can't start based on a story of one person in the wilderness by himself, right? Moses meets God at the burning bush, and God tells him, go tell the Jews that I'm going to take him out of Egypt. And Moses says, they're not going to believe me if I come with this story that I'm by myself in the desert. And God agrees with him and says, bring them here. Once you take him out of Egypt, bring them and they will serve God on this mountain. And this is the Torah portion that we actually just read last week, the giving of the Ten Commandments and the rest of the Torah. There's actually an halacha that when the Ten Commandments, halacha is a Jewish law, that when we read the Ten Commandments, we're not supposed to stand in the synagogue because there's been this I think some conservatives and some other places have done this, and there's become mostly in the States this type of idea that when we're reading the Torah and it comes to the reading of the Ten Commandments, there's been some customs of places where they started saying please rise for the Ten Commandments, and like they give extra weight to this part being read. Rabbi Ovadia Yosef and many other Jewish halachic rulings have said that's absolutely not a good custom, and that we should not do that. That it's something that's recently developed. Why? Because the Jews throughout history never stood at this specific Torah portion. Why? Because we don't want people to think, oh, this is all they really received. They just got these 10 categories at Sinai. And this is really the main thing because the 10 commandments have been taken and sensationalized and turned into like this overarching theme of be a good person, don't kill, don't steal, and you're going in the way of God. The problem with that is that just like in secular law that we examine, they're very, very vague because these are just categories. The Ten Commandments have within them, they're the main categories that have hundreds and hundreds of subcategories of specifics. And if you recall in our lectures, we talked about how you have to get to the specifics because the moment you say don't kill and you don't have very specific details, then what does that mean? What about self-defense? What about a fetus? What about a million other situations, right? What about don't steal? What about, what if I'm at work and, I'm on the phone and I'm an hourly worker? Is that called stealing, right? There's a lot of different things specifics that go into it. And when you take the Torah and you turn it into 10 categories and say, hey, this is what the Jews received, you're doing a big disservice to Judaism and to the Word of God. And as soon as the next Torah portion, the one we're meeting this week, is called Parshat Mishpatim. and it literally means laws, and it's many, many other laws, and a lot of it is torts, things having to do with damages, and a lot of laws that people have never heard of, but it's right there next to the same commandments as the Ten Commandments. So let's not get lost in the headings and really focus on the details. And we saw that when the Jews came to Sinai, we talked about in detail how this revelation was in front of millions, how this could not be fabricated. And whoever wants to understand more on why that is, why it can't be fabricated, really needs to listen to those two lectures because it's a lot of information that we need to go through. But we talked about how it was then transferred from generation to generation. And we did that with a clever parable called the Holocaust Commemoration Society. So that's really the strongest technical evidence when it comes to, and this is really the difference why I say that for me, the strongest evidence is the prophecies, chapter 5, but the technical strongest evidence is chapter 6, is the transmission system. I'll explain to you guys why I view it that way. The the strongest technical evidence really is the fact that there was a revelation and it was passed from generation to generation. The problem with this, though, when we are learning it or we are trying to teach it to someone else, it's a bit complicated to explain this all. It took me 2 lectures, maybe 3 hours to explain in detail all the different logical things about how this didn't become a broken telephone situation. How do we know that somebody didn't just write that millions of people saw, but there really was only one person? How do we know that somebody didn't just make the whole thing up? So there's many, many questions that are easily addressed, but it takes time to do that. And people argue with it until they understand the whole thing. The prophecies you can't really argue with. I mean, who's gonna say that the Jews weren't kicked out of every city there that exists in Europe, right? Who's gonna say the Jews haven't been wandering in anti-Semitism for 2,000 years? Who's gonna say the Jews haven't always been a very small amount since they were kicked out of the diaspora 2,000 years ago, never being over 18 million people? Who's going to say that the Jews didn't come back to Israel in 1948, right? These are facts that are easily digestible and explainable. So while the technical evidence of millions of people receive this and have been safeguarding it and passing it from generation to generation is the strongest form of evidence, just like any other historical event, right? We talked about this. How do we know that the Japanese bombed Pearl Harbor? Because there were lots of credible participatory eyewitnesses, and this transferred in a credible way from generation to generation. So why wouldn't you believe this? It's the same thing in Judaism, except with many more witnesses than the bombing of Pearl Harbor. So this is really what the evidence chapters are based on. And then after that, we moved on to talk about the oral law, other religions, meaning of life. We'll circle back to that. I just wanted to point out here that the Torah, like as we just talked about the Ten Commandments and specifics, a bit more information on the details of that is that there are 613 base commandments that have many, many subcategories, but these base commandments, they cover every aspect of human behavior, all received at Mount Sinai. It's organized into 1,696 different chapters and with 15,000 different sections prescribing specific guidance for every situation. Because we talked about how, in order to arrive at a divine value system, that we need to mold ourselves to fit God's word and not the other way around, right? Which is what's happening in our society, which is that we're doing exactly the opposite, right? We are deciding what's comfortable for us and legislating accordingly. So the Torah really gets into very, very specific situations on almost every situation you can fathom, and some that maybe you can't fathom either. We'll further break this down that we're not just dealing with things that are facilitating societal function or violent crimes, right? The law doesn't have time to deal with every single type of behavior, what's moral or not, right? The law deals with broad issues. A lot of people in family court, where I spent years litigating, get very frustrated in the family court where the court doesn't really have an answer for every little thing that's going on in the divorce or for every little thing that's happening, or even sometimes with big things that are happening with custody of the children. because the court can't address every single situation and every single type of behavior. It's just really there to make sure that the overall society is functioning and protecting people from violent crimes, but doesn't really get into what is necessarily moral. And we gave many examples of that in previous lectures. But Judaism does. It gets down into the nitty-gritty on many, many, many details. Again, you guys don't have to write this down because this will be available on the Know Haida website, this PowerPoint presentation. But we have 17 sections in the Torah that deal with conduct in the lavatory, right? When a person is by themselves, nobody sees him, there is conduct for what is appropriate conduct in the lavatory. 198 sections that deal with marital intimacy, 376 sections dealing with proper eating, right? 50 sections on loans, kindness, 97 sections dealing with honoring parents and teachers. I think honoring parents is probably one of the most difficult commandments to perform. Not I say, the some of our greatest sages have said that properly honoring one's parents is one of the most difficult commandments to perform because there's so many strenuous things. Do you know that you're not even allowed to sit in your father's chair? You can't even a son who tells his father that he's right in front of other people, right? Let's say that his father's arguing with somebody on an issue or debating, and his son jumps in and says, "Yeah, Dad, you're absolutely right." That is a sign of disrespect. That's an Isul Torah. You're not allowed to do that. Why? Who are you, the son, to come and tell your father that he's right? Why do you think you're even on this same level that he needs your justification? There's many, many things about honoring one's parents, not only in this life, but even once they pass away, which is actually where the real honoring of the parents starts. Once parents pass on, what you do for them and their soul in their afterlife. 122 sections on charity and giving. So we see that the Torah really gets down into specifics dealing with kindness, honoring scholars, welcoming visitors, visiting the sick, comforting mourners, and so much more. So it doesn't really leave any vague area as to what God considers the correct or appropriate behavior. It's not the Wild West of laws where people are really, doing what's comfortable for them and saying that it's good. Now, we've kind of gone through this in detail, so I don't want to harp too much more on this specific issue. But really, the bottom line is that in any given scenario, we need to mold our behavior to fit the Torah code as opposed to molding the code to fit society's behavior. Now, we talked in detail about the meaning of life also, and we talked in detail about the meaning of suffering. I encourage anybody who hasn't seen heard those lectures to go through those. Those were really lectures that I wanted to put into the book in the end to answer, because you can write the whole book just on the questions of the meaning of life or the meaning of suffering, but I wanted to give an overview that once we have gone through this evidence and we have come to a point, a logical point where the proof is overwhelming that this is a divine document and a divine value code. So why are we here then? What does this same value code really tell us about our purpose, whether it be it Jews or Gentiles or in this world? What is our role? So I really broke that down in those lectures. Those are very, very important, very fundamental, basic Jewish lectures. Again, not things that I made up. Everything is things that are, Jewish philosophy handed down throughout the ages and our sages, and all I did was summarize the things and make them a bit accessible, especially in English as opposed to the original Hebrew. We talked about also, we had a whole lecture on the oral law, which is very, very important also to understand that you really you can't perform Judaism. You can't really perform a single Torah commandment without the oral law. And we went into detail as to why God did it that way. And we also provided lots of evidence that you can't even read the original Hebrew that is written without punctuation, without an oral tradition on how to read it. So many examples that we gave there for anybody who has questions about the oral law and how different rabbinical laws come into play within the scenario. And one thing I want you guys to remember from that lecture is that very rarely is there a question on what is the law that we received in Sinai. Most of the work that you see in these halacha books and the Jewish scholars that are working to interpret the law is very rarely the question of what is the law. What is the law is clear. The question is how to apply the law, right? So, for example, we have a base commandment about lighting fire on the Sabbath. We all know that you're not allowed to light a fire on the Sabbath. But back when the Torah was given, we didn't have Teslas or we didn't have, refrigerators with LED lights. Are those considered lighting fire or not on the Sabbath? These are the types of things is how do we apply what was given at Sinai to the new technologies and to new things throughout that have developed over time or to just new circumstances, right? There's very difficult questions now in halacha. We're in a situation right now, the Jewish people are in a situation where we're in Israel, where we are governed by there are other Jewish people that are in the government or judges that are in the government, but they are not operating under Jewish law. What does the Jewish law say in a situation like that? This is something that is new, right? Normally the Jews were keeping the Jewish law while they were underneath the rule of a non-Jewish kingdom, right? The Jews were in England, they were in France, they were in Russia, they were in Spain, and they were under the law, they were under the rule of a non-Jewish government, and there's very clear laws how Jews need to behave in these places. Dina del Malchuta Dina, right? That are about your taxes, about making sure that you're doing things in these countries that isn't jeopardizing other Jews, that you're not behaving in a way that brings shame on the Jewish people. There's many laws on dealing and how do Jews need to act when they're in foreign countries under the rule and the respect that's owed to these rulers. There's even a blessing said that when you see a king, there is a blessing that when you see a king in Masechet Brachot, you say the blessing Shechalak migvodo lebasar v'dam. He who has given from his honor to mankind. So there's very specific laws about how Jews are to act when they're in the diaspora. But what about when it is Jews that are themselves supposed to be keeping the Torah and they're not, and they're the ones in charge? What do you do, right? So all these questions and subjects that come up. Also, for example, science of, I spent almost 3, 4 months studying the question of a pregnancy with surrogacy, right? This was technology that didn't exist at the time that the Torah was given. So if there's a couple that can't have children, are they allowed to do it in a way with a surrogate? What if, as the surrogate mother, if she's Jewish, she's not Jewish? I mean, there's so many laws that come into play that the rabbinical ordinances need to deal with, but it has nothing to do with what did we receive at Sinai. It has to do with what are the categories that we received and how do we apply them to these situations. There's a lot of very interesting new halachic questions that have come up just from the new technologies. I remember as a kid, I still today love gummy bears, right? I have a thing for gummy bears. Always love gummy bears. And gummy bears contain gelatin, and a lot of times they're from animals, and sometimes even from pigs. And when I grew up as a kid, they were always, I couldn't eat, I saw their kids all the time in America eating gummy bears, and I couldn't eat 99% of these gummy bears because they almost always had gelatin. And you never know what animal it came from. So I'd have to wait till, nowadays they have kosher gummy bears made from fish gelatin all over the place. But when I was a kid, it wasn't so, it was a novelty. So we'd have to wait once in a while when someone was in New York or LA or in Israel to bring us kosher gummy bears. But the halacha really today, we still, just I think because we're so used to it, we still will only buy kosher gummy bears. But the halacha today has really come to the point and understood that, like, for example, Rabbi Ovadia Yosef has ruled that the process of gelatin it's really, even if a gummy bear contains non-kosher gelatin, it is still permissible to eat. Why? And this is I'm getting into this just to give you guys an example, an idea how Torah works. We know that we're not allowed to eat and benefit to enjoy a non-kosher animal, right? The Torah says you're not allowed to eat a pig, for example, right? Now, when does a pig stop becoming a pig, right? Because if we look at what goes through the with the animals when they turn them into gelatin, is it can it even be called a pig anymore? Is it something just gelatin in its base? Would a dog even eat it? And the answer is no. If you just put the chemical compound that is gelatin before they put in the gummy bears, even a dog wouldn't eat it because it just becomes a chemical. They essentially grind up bones and they put them through this system and they you can go on YouTube and watch a video about it. But what they do is they essentially turn this into a chemical compound that has no taste, that has no relation anymore to a pig. Now, all halachic authorities have ruled that if there's some kind of gelatin in a medicine, for example, that's absolutely permissible, right? Because you're not eating, you're not enjoying it. It's a medicine that you're taking. The Torah outlined enjoying it, to benefiting from it, tasting it. But here, even with the gummy bears, right, we have a situation where it's been turned into a chemical compound and it's not food even anymore. It's a substance that is just holding the sugar and other really bad things for you and food coloring and things together. So there is still a rabbinical dispute about this where some will say, no, 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 you still can't do it. But the bottom line is that it is permitted. And now, does this mean that we didn't know in Mount Sinai what we are or aren't allowed? We were told you're not allowed to benefit and enjoy eating a pig. But now we have this new thing called gelatin. Does that fit or not? That is where the rabbinical machlokot, where we start seeing where you say one rabbi's ruled this way and one rabbi's ruled that way. And people say, well, then how can we say that this is a divine code given from God, right? Every rabbi just kind of says what they want. It's very far from the truth. And the questions that sometimes they will get into are really the depth and analysis is really beyond anything that I've ever seen anywhere else, even in my legal career. We're talking about people that sleep 2 hours a day, maybe, and that round the clock for 70, 80 years of their life are just studying and reading and writing. We're talking about people that barely eat and barely sleep. And all they do is round the clock study. It's a different level um, of devoutness and of I mean the Torah scholars that reach this level are really what the Jewish foundation is of that generation. And there's been many people like this that have kept the Torah law and the Torah alive throughout the generations. So we talked a lot about the oral law. We talked about chapter 8. We talked about other religions, and we focused specifically on Christianity and Islam because those are the two biggest monotheistic religions. And many Noahides also usually come from Christianity, some from Islam also, but mostly from Christianity. So I wanted to devote an entire lecture to what are the fundamental differences. And you guys can go back and watch that lecture. I think it's clear that the Christian and Muslim doctrine they're fundamentally not in line with, and they are not compatible with Judaism for many reasons that I outlined in that lecture, where one of the biggest problems that both religions have is that they rely on the Old Testament as the Word of God. And then they both come and say, okay, but here's part two, right? Here's the New Testament for the Christians. Here is the Quran for the Muslims. The problem is that these books are inconsistent with the original, both having logical deficiencies, theological differences, and that can't be bridged, and also contradictions that are both internal and external to the Old Testament and internal to themselves. So we don't really need to focus on that. It's also an important lecture for whoever wants to know the difference. But the bottom line is that Judaism maintains that the Torah in its original form, given at Mount Sinai, the 613 base commandments, the seven Noahide laws, this is the word of God, and the Torah itself, which both Christianity and Islam say is the word of God, says specifically, you shall not add and you shall not subtract. And we went through that very, very specifically, and all the sites are in that lecture and in those PowerPoints and in the book. And the moment the Torah comes and says, "You shall not add, you shall not subtract," we got to take God at His word, right? The idea that God gave these laws and then says, "Okay, well, I didn't really mean this," or something's come along that I've changed my mind. That's just very inconsistent with the Torah and with the later prophets. So anyone who is interested in that can go back and review that lecture as well. Judaism is not a missionary movement. Um, and that's really important here for Noahides to understand. I think this is a very new thing that Jews are doing a type of outreach to non-Jews to teach them about the Noahide laws. This is really kind of a end of days prophecy phase because if we think about where the Jews were at over the last couple thousand years, Jews were running for their lives, right? We weren't in any situation, not in Spain, not in the Arab countries that the Jews were in, not definitely not in Europe, throughout the diaspora, for Jews to really come along and tell Christians during that time or tell Muslims, hey, guess what? There's lots of theological contradictions and also, grammatical errors in your texts. You guys should go back to the Old Testament and read what it says there and perform the seven Noahide laws. I think the Jews had enough problems on their hands without taking that kind of position in the places that they were. But nowadays we see that there's many, many people around the world that want to know more about Judaism, many Christians that want to understand better the Old Testament, many Christians that are leaving Christianity and becoming Noahides, and many that are just converting also to Judaism. But Judaism in its sense is not in its essence, is not a missionary organization. And that's because the Torah teaches that God created the world in balance. Not everybody has to be Jewish. You don't have to convert to Judaism in order to perfect yourself and to fulfill your role in the world. Um, Even within Judaism, there is this hierarchy. We need to understand that just like we have 613 commandments for a Jewish person and seven Noahide commandments, which has many, many subcategories. Those seven is a handful also. We have within Judaism, there are certain laws within these 613 that I can't perform. Why? Because I'm not a Cohen, and I'm not a Levite. I'm not a Levi. I'm not a Cohen. I'm not a king, right? I'm not from. I don't know if I don't even know if I'm from the Davidic line or not, right? Maybe I'm from the house of David. Maybe I'm from the tribe of Benjamin. I have no idea at this stage. But there are many things within Judaism that only a Cohen can perform, right? Where God sets apart, God took Aaron and said, from this day forth, your children that are born to you, they're gonna be Cohens, and only they can do certain things. Only they can work and perform the sacrifices in the temple, and only the Levites can do certain things. So, do we come along and say, "Hey, wait a second, this is not fair. We should all be equal," right? It's not a matter of fair or not fair. It's a matter of what has God given out as roles to different people. I don't come to the Cohen and say, "Hey, it's not fair. I want to be a Cohen." You say, "Well, you're not a Cohen. What can I do? You weren't born a Cohen. You're not a Cohen." And this has to really do with the spiritual root of every single person. Because what we see here in the physical world is external, but every one of us has a root of where they're from spiritually, where their soul is from, and different commandments that are really geared towards their specific soul. And this is where the faith and the trust comes in, that we really got to just understand that God knows what He's doing. And He knows where He put you, and He knows where you were born, and He knows what your faults are, and He knows what your weaknesses are, and He knows what your strengths are. And we kind of need to put this whole "it's not fair" attitude, and everything needs to be equal, and kind of let God run the show. I mean, it's also not fair to some person who was born in poverty, and he can kick and scream all day and say, "Hey, it's not fair. Why was Barron Trump born into the Trump family?" Right? There's a very big difference between Barron Trump, whose father is the president of the United States and they have billions of dollars and he has access to the best education in the world, than somebody that's born into a poor family and, somewhere in South Central Los Angeles, right? Is it fair? Do we think of it that way? But it has nothing to do with fair. It has to do with this is what it is. This is, and God in His infinite wisdom has put certain people in certain positions because that is their role. That is what is going to be what they need to fix. Some people will be born and they're going to be wealthy, no matter how smart or how dumb they are. They're going to be wealthy. Why? Because what they need to do is they need to learn how to be less stingy and be charitable. So God makes them wealthy and says, "Okay, let's see if you're able to give charity or not." Right? If he's poor, you can't ask him to give charity. So it's not an issue of fair or equality. It's an issue of understanding that there is a balance and a purpose in creation, and we need to let God run the show. And this is it's a big thing also for people to understand their day-to-day life. There's nothing to be jealous about. You see somebody who's got more money or smarter or whatever they have going on, or they're successful and you're less successful. This is their tikkun. This is their life. This is their, you don't know what their exact hardships are. You don't know what God expects of them. You don't know what they did in their previous life. You don't need to focus on other people and jealousy. You need to focus on you and doing what the best you can with what God has given you. That is what God is asking of us. Um, the problem is that our society has kind of mucked all this up. Western culture has kind of turned everything into this. Let's all the idea of equality, which sounds very nice. I mean, and I agree, we should absolutely equally treat everybody with respect. Maybe that's where we kind of go wrong. Forget where we need to apply the equality, and when you try to put it across the board, it comes out a bit odd because then we are not recognizing fundamental differences in people and their cultures and their gender and their identities, the way they see the world. So the Torah teaches that God created the world in balance, and mankind should work to preserve this balance while recognizing the different roles different groups play. The Gentiles of the world are in no way looked down upon by the Torah, as many would believe that Judaism is this elitist religion, right, where the Jews are like chosen and everybody else isn't as cool. It's far from the truth. Rather, Gentiles, just like the Jews, are loved as cherished as children of the living God. But there's different roles and different commandments given. Now, the 613 commandments that we talked about for Jews, many of those commandments also, many of those commandments I can't perform myself, right? Many of them only have to do with Cohens. Many of them have to do only in certain places. Many of them only in certain times. But the seven Noahide commandments, we'll go over them briefly, what they are. I'm sure you guys know in general what they are, but we'll touch the topic again because it's very important for me to um, very important that we understand that these seven are just the categories, much like the Ten Commandments are categories, with every one of these having many, many, many subcategories. So, prohibition against idolatry, first and foremost, is that everyone needs to understand that there is only one God, and there is nothing before him, and there will be nothing after him, and he is creating the world in this very instant. There is nothing that God is sharing with. There is no shituf. There is no other power that preceded him, and there is no other power. There is nothing besides him. And od milvado. There is nothing besides God. God, literally in the Kabbalah, anybody who studies a little bit of Kabbalah knows that our very existence is within a place where God diluted his own light so that we could exist. Meaning God is infinite light in all directions and above space and time in the way that we can't even fathom. And in order for there to be able for something else besides God to exist, God had to dilute, letzamtzem, had to dilute himself. And these are just, again, these are analogies because we can't even understand the essence of God. God had to dilute himself in order to create a space with somewhat less of him, for lack of a better term, in order for us to be able to even exist within him. So when we say there is nothing void of God, we literally mean that. There is nothing here that cannot be God. God is everything. He's every one of us. He's light. He's everything. There's nothing besides him. Um, and anyone who tells you otherwise has a fundamental misconception of what God is. God is Shema Yisrael, Hashem Elokeinu, Hashem Echad. This is what the children of Jacob answered when Jacob on his deathbed asked him, "Hear, O Israel, the Lord is God, the Lord is one." Um, Prohibition of blasphemy, right? Using God's name in vain. Many, many subcategories of this. Murder, again, many, many questions that rise up in the modern world of what constitutes murder. Um, and and again, I've talked about it a lot. Is this book again? I don't I talk about this book so much that people think I'm maybe getting paid to advertise that. I assure you, I don't get any percentages. I've never even met the author in person. I'd love to meet Rabbi Moshe Weiner, but this is just the best that I've seen and the most comprehensive that I've seen on the subject. I studied this book myself. And whoever, has anybody here gotten a copy of this book and been through it at all? Leo? Uh,
Yeah, it's really that good. It's really
yeah,
really a good
excellent.
book.
Very comprehensive, and it just shows just the thickness of it shows how much detail is really put into all of this. So these the different sexual morality, prohibition of theft, establishment of courts, the idea the rule of establishment of courts in itself really creates an enormous amounts of laws to study. Now, um, it's very important that Noahides spend time studying together these laws. That's what we do. I mean, we don't have here in my city here, we don't have movie theaters and bars and stuff like that. In the evening, we set a couple of times. There's people that study all day, but other people that are working or lecturing or whatever, we set time every morning, a couple hours where we go and we're studying a certain topic and we sit in groups and we study. I encourage you guys to break off into groups. They can be on Zoom, on your own, with Rabbi Peretz. But if you're studying the Divine Code, to learn, to read, to learn these specific laws, many of the things that have to do with establishment of courts through this main category, there's many laws that have to do with just even the laws of theft, the laws of if you find something, do you have to return it to its owner? What lengths do you have to go to return it to its owner? This type of focusing on the specifics of God's law is a very high form of spirituality. People don't understand that. People think that spirituality is sitting in the forest and meditating somewhere and emotionally connecting to God. That's also spirituality. That's great. But even higher form than that is immersing oneself in God's law, understanding God's law, learning not just for the theoretical knowledge, but because you want to perform it. And what you're doing is synchronizing your thoughts with what the divine thoughts are. That's why it's very important that we study not just to accumulate knowledge. We're studying because we want to connect to God. We want our logic to conform to His logic and to understand. And sometimes we derive a law from logic because logic itself is God given, right? The idea of being able to deduce or deduce. This is one of the 13 ways that laws are deduced. It's called kal v'chomer, right? When I know the smaller thing, I don't want to get into it because I've given you guys so much information today, but logic is a way that you can deduce laws also. And sitting and learning and studying these things brings a person closer to God because if we don't know, we can't perform. And this is a very famous Rashi commentary in Parshat Bechukotai. The Torah says that if you go and follow my laws, and the Torah gives all the blessings, and then the Torah says if you don't follow my laws, then comes many of the bad things that will befall you if you don't follow the laws. So there's Rashi, who's one of the Rishonim, a very famous commentator, probably the most famous commentator of all time, who has a commentary on all of the Talmud and all the Torah and all everything. I mean, there's nothing without Rashi. And Rashi says there, and if you follow my laws, Rashi interprets, if you will toil in the Torah, in the study of the Torah. And Rashi explains, one who doesn't study, he doesn't know. And if he doesn't know, then he doesn't do. And if he doesn't do, then he starts looking at people that are doing oddly. He distanced himself from the ones that are doing. And in the end, it brings him to the worst things. Rashi shows the progression. And it all starts from didn't learn. Because if you don't know, then you can't perform. Didn't know, didn't do. So the Torah is very focused on not just theoretical knowledge, but knowledge that actually becomes part of us that makes us turns us into better people, that asks us perform the commandments, because we're in a physical world, that God created the physical world in order for us to perform the commandments in them and not just to know them theoretically. So the study of, and also, as you will see when you guys learn this book, that a Gentile who studies to perform because they were commanded through Moses, these laws, has very, very, very great reward in the next world. The study in itself is one of the biggest mitzvahs, one of the biggest commandments that you can perform, because, like I explained, you are synchronizing your thoughts, which is the highest form, right? Your intelligence, you're synchronizing with that of the Almighty. Um, so we've talked about this in general, and I want to talk about the concept of a Baal Tshuva. And this concept is, the Talmud talks about it normally in reference to Jews that have gone off the path and returned, become a penitent. But as you will see throughout the book in the Divine Code, it is the same, is relevant for Noahides as well. The Talmud says in Tractate Brachot, in a place where a Baal Tshuva, a penitent, stands, even the holy righteous do not stand. Um, Many, many books have been written on this passage to really understand what this means. But we are in a situation in this world nowadays where even, I mean, for example, I'm a Baal Tshuva. I didn't grow up in a Orthodox observant household. I was born in San Diego, California. I went to Jewish school when I was younger, but then I went to public high school, right? I went through different times in my life also where I didn't even know many of these Torah commandments until I was learned many of the same things that I'm teaching today, that I'm teaching to you guys today. So we're in a situation where many, many people, and it's the same thing for Noahides and for Gentiles, that simply grew up in a world where they didn't know. They didn't know what God expected of them, and it's a confusing place, the world. And there's, I mean, people's ideologies are formed throughout their life, different teachers, different friends, different parents, that many of them themselves don't know much about these topics. So God understands this, and this is part of the challenge, is finding God. And a person who really, really wants to know the truth and is seeking and is learning, he's going to direct him to this way. But once a person has seen the truth, or has been given the opportunity to learn and to better himself, um, this is really where the faith part really comes in. Because once your brain understands a certain thing, how are you now going to live with that knowledge? Because the moment a person does three things, what is tshuva? What does tshuva really mean? Tshuva means the penitence. What does penitence mean? Do I now have to go and suffer and fast and give all my money away to charity? No. The Rambam writes three very specific laws that are relevant also for Noahides, and it's the same thing. What is penitence? What is tshuva? One is charata al avar, meaning I am now acknowledging acknowledging that what I did, whatever actions that I took, that they were not good, and I am going back on them. Meaning, if I would be put back in the same situation, I would have wished I never did it. Right? Understanding what I did wrong. That's one. Two is vidui, actually saying out loud to yourself, this is what were my sins. This is what I did. You don't have to go do it in front of a rabbi. You don't have to put it up on the internet. You need to say out loud directly to God, these were the sins that I did. That vidui. So you understand clearly what you did wrong. And then Kabbalah Latid. Kabbalah Latid means I now take upon myself not to do this anymore in the future. I now understand that this is God's given law. I'm going to do everything I can to conform to it. I'm going to study what I don't know. I'm going to do my best to learn. And I'm taking this upon myself for the future. That's it. Now, easier said than done, right? A person can say that, he can take these three steps, but the question is now, it's not a one-time event. It's to live this way, to live this way throughout life, now understanding what my mission is in life, that this world is finite, right? That we're all going to come at the end. Nobody gets to stay here, right? At a certain point, we're all on our way out. Anybody who's never been to a funeral, I suggest you attend one to see the somber reality of it. And I suggest you take your kids too, not when they're too young, But I think kids, once they get past the being, once they're a bit older in the late teen years, if there's a family member, you don't need to try to shield them too much from these things. Not if they're very young, then obviously yes. But as they're into their mid-teens, and if somebody passes away, right, and it's not, God forbid, not saying I wish that on anybody, but this is part of life, right? Grandparents pass away, uncles, aunts, people get older, they pass away. Sometimes people get sick, they pass away. This is a part of life. And taking a young a teen to see this can have a profound effect on them because we all think we're invincible. All of us, when we were teenagers, especially, we always hear about other people dying, but it's not something that happens to us. And this is a type of kindness that God does with us so that we don't live in the constant fear of death because we think it's something that only happens to other people. But to see where the end of every human being is, no matter how much money they have, no matter how influential they were, where we are going, where our physical bodies are going, is very sombering. And it really gets people thinking, what is important? What am I taking with me? All these things that I'm worried about, are they really important? And it's important for kids to see this too. Important for young people to know because these young people these days are in a complete la la land. They're in fantasy TikTok land. I talk to young people sometimes, I don't even know where they are. They are in a whole nother world of fantasy. Um, and the somber reality is that this world is very, very quick, goes by fast, and God gives us an enormous, enormous opportunity to do great things with our life or to waste it. And most people, I don't want to say most, many people, probably most people waste their life because there is an active force in the world working against us, trying to get us to waste our life, right? That we've talked about this in the Meaning of Life chapter in detail. So a penitent is seen as very, very, very high place. And why is it that a penitent is even more righteous than the holy righteous, right? Why is it that in a place where a Baal Tshuva stands, even the holy righteous cannot stand? Does anybody want to answer the question? Have you thought about it? I mean, you could say, look, somebody who went off the path and came back, they're also righteous. But why does the Talmud say that in a place where a Baal Tshuva stands, even the holy righteous cannot stand? Does anybody want to take a crack at the question? No?
Because you're doing it voluntarily, Rabbi?
Sorry?
Because you're doing it voluntarily? You're coming and returning voluntarily?
Well, yeah, that's a big part of it also, but we could also say that many of the righteous, I mean, they're also doing it voluntarily, but they are they held on always, right? They never let themselves go off the path, right? You went off and then you said, "Okay, I'm voluntarily coming back." But he never went off, right? Who do you trust more? Somebody that always made their payments or somebody that stopped making their payments for a few years and then said, "I'm sorry," and continued to make them? Is he better than the one that always made his
Mhm.
payments? I'm not so sure, right? So even though it's voluntary, that's important. But not now, look, there's no really wrong or right answer because many, like I said, many books have been written on this. But I'll share with you something that I find very interesting and very to me it explains the topic better. I think that, and we see this a lot these days, is Baalei Tshuva are put into situations and we're born into places and are exposed to things that many holy righteous people can never even fathom, right? Somebody like Rabbi Ovadia Yosef or Chazon Ish or many of these great sages or many of the great sages that are alive in this generation, they've never been exposed to a nightclub, right? Since they were young kids, they were always studying Torah. They've never been in a nightclub. They weren't in places, in low places. They'd never been exposed to drugs or alcohol abuse, right? There's many people that become penitents about a tshuva that they've gone through and been exposed to many, many things that holy righteous people never had that challenge. We're never exposed to that. So one many mefarshim what they explain on this is that when you go down to somewhere low and from there you rise, you are bringing with you things. You are fixing things in the world that even a holy righteous person cannot fix because he's never been exposed to that. He's never been there. He didn't. His level is very, very high. He sees God in the world and through the Torah. but to see God from the lowest of places, people that come from addiction, come from a world of drug abuse and living in the street and abuse and sexual abuse. People coming from a very, very, very dark and low place, and they find God and they climb out of these places. It can bring them because then they're turning, they're basically saying this journey of how of a place of where I was, such a low place or such bad things that I did, and through this I am lifting this up and turning it into something holy, because if it wasn't for these experiences, if it wasn't for this low place that I attend, I never would have found God. I never would have rose to the level that I rise today. So maybe that's a part of the explanation, but it is the bottom line is many people that have been exposed to certain things, they have a lot more difficult time also. It's much harder to keep the Torah laws once you've been raised a different way, right? Because we almost always default back to what we saw in our homes. Every one of us, I don't know how much we catch ourselves turning into our parents sometimes, right? But I mean, it's very, very that's what happens, right? What your kids see in home and how they see the dad and mom act, that's how the kids are going to interact with their spouses. We know this. So someone who came from a place where their whole life they were accustomed to living a certain way. And now they come to God and they say, look, I am now going to break this. I'm going to do the opposite of what I'm used to because I want the truth. This is something very, very, very high, that we can't fathom how close to God a person like this can come. So I want to wrap up today in the series with really focusing on explaining the difference between the essential and informative questions. Everything we've done up to this point, these now I think over 12 hours of lectures that we've been here together with on the book, is we've really only dealt with the essential questions. We've asked the questions is there a God? What proof is there that he spoke to humanity, right? We established the foundation and the evidence, and then we started touching on a little bit of the informative aspects, like why are we here? What does God want from me? But the second half, the informative part of asking every commandment, what is its basis? Where can we find it? What are the rules? How do I perform it? Why do we make a sukkah? Why do we put on tefillin? What does this law mean? What is that? These informative questions. This comes after accepting the source's reliability. Now, what is really the problem? Most people start from, and this is also with many teachers, they start with the informative questions, right? This is the big mistake. We start with asking the questions, why do I need to do this? Why do I get to keep this commandment? Why do men put on tefillin? Why is there a tzitzit? Why does God care if I eat non-kosher animals? We start with the informative questions, and then when something doesn't make sense to us, or it sounds primitive, or it sounds like something that's not relevant to the modern world, we say, okay, this is not for me. That's really the catch. The question is really to start from the essential questions. Before we get into the details of the laws, we want to understand all the things that we've been through. Now that I know there's a God, He gave the Torah, it's been transferred, there's an oral law. What does the oral law mean? What is the meaning of? Now that I'm armed with this foundational knowledge, I have this basis, this foundation. Now I understand that when I'm learning a new commandment or learning something that I don't understand, I'm not so quick to toss it away as irrelevant, or it's not relevant for the modern world, right? Many people say, oh, you don't drive on the Sabbath. Oh, this is primitive. This isn't for me. That's it. They're done with Judaism, right? They tossed out the Torah. They tossed it all out in 1 second, right? Because of one law that didn't make sense to them. So a person understands, wait a second, if I don't understand one of these commandments, that doesn't mean that there's something wrong with the commandments. There's something wrong with me. Maybe I don't understand it. Maybe I need to work harder to understand it, right? So this is really the focusing on the essential questions helps humble a person, because you need to come with humility if you're going to come closer to God. You need to come willing to learn and to accept. And the big difference is that many religions will skip the essential part also. They will start with, let's just accept on faith the essential questions and then move on to the informative part. Judaism doesn't do that. Judaism gives us a robust, let's ask the harder questions, let's understand logically the essential questions. Once that is a strong foundation, we can now spend the rest of our lives studying what the informative aspects are, in which that is really what Torah is. The study of Torah is spending your life understanding the informative aspects. So this course and this book was really just an introduction to Judaism's fundamental tenets, right? Everybody's encouraged to analyze, to verify, to research the ideas, the arguments presented. Then, once we've internalized that process, the informative part should begin. Understanding the who, what, where, when, and why of every Torah commandment is the constant challenge that's undertaken in great study halls across the globe.